Karva el nafshi. My soul draw near, as in draw near to the Holy One. It's actually a line from Lecha Dodi, the song that we sing on Friday nights as we welcome Shabbos. That was Eitan Katz and Zusha teaming up to make that beautiful song. Let's light up the darkness. Who's gonna be with us on a fine Tuesday night as we do a little bit of learning here in chapter 6, opening the second volume of Tractate Pesachim. Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina. Rochelle says, good evening. John in Sedona. James in Indianapolis. Ann in Merced. Sandy in Michigan. Gail in Virginia. Lucy in Minnesota. Stephen in New Hampshire. Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey. Paula here from Oregon. Arnold from Northridge. He's been away and looking forward to this time together. Chaim in Charlotte, ready for a night of learning. Natalie Anfosso says, shalom from Italy. Welcome, Natalie. Nice to have you with us. Brienne Metro City is here from the Philippines. Welcome, Brienne. Renee says, Indy in the house. Christo in Lubbock. Miriam in Hayden, Colorado. Dorothy in Pittsburgh. Manu T. Gouda says, good morning. I'm not sure where from. Nancy in North Carolina. Randy in Florida. Gwen, a couple of thumbs ups. Pam is, and Manu is in India. Welcome, Manu. It's so great to have you with us all the way from India. Pam in Nashville. Jesse in Texas. Russell in North Carolina. Allison also in Texas. And Susan from London in the United Kingdom. Welcome, Susan. We are very international this evening. Also, Gigi in British Columbia, Canada, and Marjorie in Georgia. Welcome, everybody. We've got a very cool class this evening. I'm sure you're going to enjoy. We're going to be hearing a little bit about the early days of the great sage Hillel and a spectacular and important wisdom teaching that applies in all our lives so often, more often than we probably care to admit. And I'm really happy that I'm learning and teaching this particular idea today about anger, because truthfully, I needed to hear it. I lost my cool earlier today as I was wrestling with the electronics of the house, trying to install a new doorbell. And I just got all flustered and verklempt, and there was no reason for it. But we'll get to that a little bit in a little while. First, we're dedicating tonight's episode of AT Daily. My good friend Chaim Marks, thank you so much. This is in memory of Chaim's dad of blessed memory. His name was Nachum ben Nachum. He left the world on this date in the Hebrew calendar, the 14th of the Hebrew month of Shvat, some years ago. Chaim, may your dad's memory always be for a blessing, and may his neshama have a great aliyah, may his soul have a great elevation in the world to come, and may the merit of our learning today, not only across the United States, but across continents, resound to the merit of Nachum ben Nachum and take him ever higher in the world of souls. And we say Amen. And Chaim, may you and all your loved ones, may Hashem from Shemayim, from God in heaven, rain upon you and your family unlimited blessings. And we say Amen. All right. where are we holding? Today's daf, today's page of the Talmud is page 66, Samech Vav, here in Tractate Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud. Pesachim in the Koran Talmud comes in 2 volumes. In the Art Scroll, it comes in 3 volumes. But in the Koran, we open part 2, the second volume, as it were, of the fourth tractate of the Talmud. Here we're in chapter 6 and the first Mishna. This is actually a pretty lengthy Mishna. I'm going to read it in its entirety. But usually the Mishna just spells out a law and maybe 1 or 2 minority opinions, and is not so much about the whole discussion that led to a particular ruling that's recorded in the Mishnah. This particular Mishnah has such a discussion, and then we'll get into the Gemara, the further discussion of the later sages of the Talmudic period. So here we go, the first Mishnah of chapter 6, and this chapter 6 is going to be, as we saw, the second part of Tractate Pesachim. The first part was about the rules of matzah and chametz and the festival of matzahs surrounding Passover. And the second half is much more specifically about the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, the offering, and how it was brought in Jerusalem when the temple was standing. We've already alluded a little bit to that there's going to be some particular rules needed, as it were, when Erev Pesach, the afternoon before Pesach begins, before Passover begins that night, that is when the Paschal lamb was slaughtered, right? In the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan. And that would, and so then the question is, well, what if the slaughtering of the Paschal lamb coincides with Shabbos, right? The afternoon, in other words, so what this would mean is that Passover coincides with, well, Passover arrives Saturday night, right? So Motzi Shabbos, when Shabbos is over, Passover begins. So that would mean that the afternoon before Passover is during Shabbos. And as we've discussed a bunch of times, so the shechting, the slaughtering of the Paschal lamb, of the Passover offering, will override Shabbos. But what about other procedures that are part of bringing the offering, which maybe are not inherently part of that procedure? Maybe they could have been done before Shabbos, and perhaps they don't override Shabbos itself. And that's what we're going to be discussing now. So, the Mishnah. These are the matters related to the Paschal lamb that override Shabbos when the eve of Passover, right, Erev Pesach, occurs on Shabbos. And if you've been with me for a while, you know this, but I'll just mention it one more time. There's often a misunderstanding in the Jewish world of what Erev Shabbos or Erev Pesach means, right? So it's sort of like the less observant world, that's where this misunderstanding usually falls, right? So for example, Shabbos begins Friday night, right? All dates on the Hebrew calendar begin the night before. So the 24 hours of Shabbos begin Friday night and end Saturday night or Saturday evening, let's say. Erev Shabbos is not that Friday night period. Erev Shabbos means, we translate it as the eve of Shabbos, but what it means is the day before Shabbos. Erev Shabbos means the day before Shabbos. So Erev Shabbos is Friday during the day. Once it's Friday night, it is Shabbos, right? So Erev Shabbos is before that. Likewise, Erev Pesach, Erev Passover is the day before Passover. So Passover begins on Saturday night. Saturday afternoon would be Erev Pesach. And that's what we're talking about here. Erev Pesach coincides with Shabbos. So, when Erev Pesach occurs on Shabbos, the slaughter of the Korban Pesach, of the Paschal lamb, the Paschal offering, the slaughter, the sprinkling of its blood on the altar, the cleaning of its intestines, and the burning of its fats on the altar, all of which are services that must be performed on Erev Pesach while it is still day, right? While it's still day before Passover begins that night. However, It's roasting, meaning after you slaughter it in the temple, you sprinkle some of its blood on the altar, you burn its fats on the altar. The rest of it is going to be roasted and then is going to be eaten by the people who've registered to be in that group on Passover night. The roasting and the washing of its intestines do not need to be done by day. Therefore, they do not override Shabbos, right? It's prohibited to cook, to burn, etc. on Shabbos. It's prohibited to slaughter. But the slaughter of the Paschal lamb will override Shabbos. The roasting of the Paschal lamb does not override Shabbos. Rather, one waits until after Shabbos to perform these tasks. Carrying the Paschal lamb through a public domain does not override Shabbos. Now, you might think, well, wait a minute. In order to bring the Paschal lamb to the temple so that it can be slaughtered on, let's say, this Saturday afternoon when it has to be slaughtered and that overrides Shabbos, don't I have to get it there, right? Doesn't getting it there also override Shabbos because it's necessary so that it can be slaughtered at that time? But the answer is no. The rabbis say no. Carrying it, carrying is prohibited on Shabbos unless you're within an Erev. So then you might think, well, wait a minute. In the old city of Jerusalem, which was surrounded by the walls of Jerusalem, that should be a valid Erev. So you should be able to carry it through there. But as we'll see, no, it does not override Shabbos. Carrying the Paschal lamb through a public domain does not override Shabbos. The Paschal offering consisted of either a lamb or a goat, sometimes quite young and unable to walk the entire way. So it could walk there, you just can't carry it. So that it had to be carried on a person's shoulders. But carrying is not going to override Shabbos. Similarly, bringing it from outside the Shabbos limit, right? So that's the Erev Techumen, so that you are only allowed to walk a certain distance on Shabbos, 2,000 cubits from the edge of your Shabbos dwelling, which if you're in a city, it's the edge of your city. If you're out in the country, it's the edge of your property. Similarly, bringing it from outside the Shabbos limit and cutting off its wart, right? The wart is a blemish that it makes it unfit to be offered in the temple, but it's the kind of blemish that can be cured by removing the wart, but you can't do that on Shabbos. Cutting off its wart does not override Shabbos. As all of these tasks, bringing it in from the Shabbos limit, so that you don't walk too far on Shabbos, or cutting off its wart, all of these tasks could have been performed before Shabbos. You should have brought it to the temple before Shabbos. A wart is considered a blemish that disqualifies the animal from being brought as an offering, but once the wart is removed, the animal is fit to be sacrificed on the altar. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with this ruling. Rabbi Eliezer says all of these procedures do override Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer said, could this not be derived through a kal v'chomer inference, usually translated as an a fortiori inference? In other words, if slaughter, which is ordinarily forbidden on Shabbos as a biblically prohibited labor, nevertheless overrides Shabbos when it is performed for the sake of the Paschal lamb, well then these activities, namely carrying the animal, bringing it from outside the Shabbos limit, and the like, meaning removing the wart, which are prohibited due to a rabbinic decree, rather than, they don't violate a Torah law, they only violate a rabbinic decree which was issued to protect us from coming to violate Torah laws. Should they not override Shabbat? Right, since we see that normally slaughtering is definitely prohibited on Shabbat by Torah law. It's a Torah law that you can't slaughter an animal on Shabbos. But nevertheless, for the sake of the Paschal offering, we do override Shabbos. Then these other laws, which are only by rabbinic decree, shouldn't they also be overridden in order to bring the Korban Pesach, to bring the Paschal offering? That's Rabbi Eliezer's argument. Rabbi Yehoshua said to him, the law governing a Yom Tov, a festival, a holiday, proves otherwise. For the Torah permitted on it acts that are normally prohibited by Torah law as a labor. Because the Torah permitted acts that are normally prohibited. In other words, on a Yom Tov, just like Shabbos, you can't do the normal work of the week. However, on Shabbos, you're not allowed to cook. It's also prohibited to cook on Shabbos. But on a festival, it's permitted to cook. So that would normally violate that Torah prohibition on cooking, but it's permitted on a holiday. So says Rabbi Yehoshua, since slaughtering and cooking and baking are permitted on a festival, and yet it is forbidden to do on it acts that are prohibited due to rabbinic decree. There are rabbinic decrees that apply on a festival, even though cooking is permitted on a festival. Thus, we cannot derive policy with regard to rabbinic prohibitions from the rules that govern Torah laws. The fact is, just because one Torah law can be violated on Passover doesn't mean that therefore all rabbinic prohibitions can also be violated. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, "What is this, Yehoshua? How can you suggest such a weak proof? What proof can be deduced from optional activities that would apply to a mitzvah, an obligation? How does the fact that rabbinic decrees remain in effect on a festival with respect to optional activities prove that one is also forbidden to transgress a rabbinic decree in order to fulfill an obligatory action like the mitzvah of offering the Paschal lamb?" Rabbi Akiva responded and said in defense of Rabbi Yehoshua's opinion, "Listen, Rabbi Eliezer, let me show you an example where your proof is going to fall apart and Rabbi Yehoshua's proof is going to stand." Rabbi Akiva said, "Sprinkling the purifying water of a red heifer upon someone who had contracted ritual impurity through contact with a corpse proves the matter." Okay, so if when the temple is standing, a person comes into contact with a human corpse, that's a very severe form of tuma, of ritual impurity. In order to become tahor again, to become ritually pure and thus qualified to enter the temple grounds, no person could enter the temple when they're in a state of ritual impurity. So if you touched a corpse, you're tameh, you're ritually impure, and to become tahor, pure again, a bunch of things have to happen. Among them, you're going to need to be sprinkled with this water mixed with the ashes of the red heifer on the 3rd and 7th day after you contracted that tuma. And then on the 7th day, after you've observed 7 days of not touching any other corpses, you were sprinkled with this water on the 3rd day and then sprinkled again on the 7th day. Then after that, I believe you can immerse in the mikvah, the purification waters that you immerse in, and then you wait till nightfall, and then you're going to be qualified, you're going to be tahor and qualified to enter the temple again. So the sprinkling, right? Sprinkling is part of that purification process. It's commanded by the Torah that if you touched a corpse, you have to go through that purification process so that you can go into the temple grounds again. But sprinkling, what Rabbi Akiva is going to teach us, sprinkling was prohibited by rabbinic decree on Shabbos. So if the 7th day, so you touched a corpse, a human corpse on Shabbos, the next Shabbos would be your 7th day. Or actually, maybe you touched it on Sunday, and then Shabbos is your 7th day. So normally that's when you would sprinkle, the 7th day. But if the 7th day is Shabbos, the rabbis prohibited you to get that sprinkling of the waters of the red heifer on Shabbos. Why? There were 2 reasons why they said no sprinkling on Shabbos. Number one, they considered it finishing, right? Like the only thing that you're waiting to do to finish your purification process is this sprinkling of the water. I mean, I think there's also waiting for nightfall and immersing in the mikvah, so it seems a little unclear. But one of the reasons given is that sprinkling is a form of finishing. And secondly, and maybe is a little bit more logical, is that they said that if sprinkling were permitted on Shabbos, people might come to carry the jar of water with that water mixed with the ashes of the red heifer. They might come to carry it through the public domain more than 4 cubits, and they would violate that Torah prohibition. That's a classic fence around the Torah, where the rabbis decreed you can't get sprinkled on Shabbos because it might lead people to carry the waters of sprinkling through the public domain on Shabbos and thereby desecrate Shabbos. So let's pick up what Rabbi Akiva is saying. So Rabbi Akiva says, sprinkling the purifying water of a red heifer upon someone who had contracted ritual impurity through contact with a corpse proves the matter. For it is done for the sake of a mitzvah, to fulfill an obligation, in order to allow the person to offer the Paschal lamb. So in this case, you also cannot bring the Paschal lamb, the Passover offering, if you're in a state of tuma, of ritual impurity. So if you were waiting, the last thing that you needed was the sprinkling of that water, that's what you need to do in order to bring the Paschal lamb. But if that day is Shabbos, you're not going to be allowed to. And it is prohibited only due to a rabbinic decree, and nevertheless, it does not override Shabbos. For the purification rite is not performed on Erev Pesach, on the eve of Passover that falls on Shabbos. So too, you should not be surprised about these activities, namely carrying the animal, bringing it from outside the Shabbos walking limit, and cutting off its wart, that although they are performed for the sake of a mitzvah, for an obligation, they are still prohibited, and they are prohibited only due to a rabbinic decree. Nevertheless, they do not override Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, I do not accept this proof. Why does Rabbi Eliezer not accept Rabbi Akiva's proof with regard to the waters of sprinkling, which are prohibited on Shabbos by rabbinic decree? He doesn't accept that because Rabbi Eliezer would allow the sprinkling on Shabbos in order to permit one to bring the Paschal offering. So he doesn't accept the underlying premise of Rabbi Akiva's counter proof. He doesn't accept it. With regard to this sprinkling itself, I infer that it too is permitted for the same reason. If slaughter, which is biblically prohibited, is a biblically prohibited labor, nevertheless overrides Shabbos when Passover is upon us, when it's Erev Pesach, is it not right that sprinkling the purifying water of a red heifer, which is prohibited only due to rabbinic decree, should override Shabbos? You cannot challenge me based on a premise with which I disagree. Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Eliezer, all right, I'll give you a different reason. Perhaps we can reverse the order of your agreement and say the opposite. Now, this is great. Rabbi Akiva is going to get into like a Perry Mason mode. You know, he's going to sort of string Rabbi Eliezer along a little bit, get him to agree, and then give him the aha moment. So here he goes. So Rabbi Akiva says, perhaps we can reverse the order of your argument and say the opposite. If, as we know by accepted tradition, sprinkling the purifying water on Shabbat, which is prohibited only due to rabbinic decree, and it does not override Shabbos, well then with regard to slaughter, which is prohibited as a biblically prohibited labor, is it not right that it should not override Shabbos? So Rabbi Akiva is saying, well, okay, so then according to what you're saying, maybe we should realize that we should not be slaughtering the Passover lamb on Shabbos, right? It's biblically prohibited to slaughter, so why are we going to do it on Shabbos? If we also hold that sprinkling, which is only prohibited by rabbinic decree, that's not going to override Shabbos. So now let's not even override Shabbos for the purpose of slaughtering the Paschal lamb, which is prohibited by the Torah. It should not override Shabbos. Therefore, it should be prohibited to slaughter the Paschal lamb when the eve of Passover occurs on Shabbos. Says Rabbi Eliezer to Akiva, how can you say that? You have thus uprooted what is expressly written in the Torah. Let the children of Israel offer the Paschal lamb in its appointed time. That's actually why we do it even if it falls on Shabbos, because the Torah says at Numbers 9:2 that the children of Israel will offer the Paschal lamb in its appointed time. The phrase at its appointed time indicates that the offering must be brought on that day, whether it is a weekday or Shabbos. Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Eliezer, my teacher, bring me an appointed time stated in the Torah for these tasks, namely carrying the animal or bringing it from outside of the Shabbos limits, like the appointed time stated with respect to slaughter. The Torah says you slaughter it at its appointed time. Does it say you must carry it at its appointed time? Does it say you must bring it from far beyond the Shabbos walking limit? Does it say that he must do that at its appointed time, even if it's on Shabbos? No, it doesn't say that. The Paschal lamb must be slaughtered on the 14th of Nisan, but there is no fixed time when the animal must be brought to the temple, and it is therefore possible to transport it before Shabbos. Rabbi Akiva stated a principle. Any prohibited labor required for the offering of the sacrifice that can be performed on Erev Shabbos does not override Shabbos. Slaughter, which cannot be performed on Erev Shabbos, right? In other words, if Passover begins Saturday night, you can't slaughter the Paschal lamb Friday afternoon. It must be slaughtered Saturday afternoon. But as for carrying the lamb to the temple, you could have done that on Friday afternoon, so it's not permitted to do it on Saturday afternoon. And that, in fact, is the halacha, right? The halacha says, if the eve of Passover occurs on Shabbos, slaughtering the Paschal lamb, sprinkling its blood, cleaning its intestines, and burning its fats override the laws of Shabbos, and they are performed in the usual manner. However, roasting it and washing its intestines do not override Shabbos. In addition, carrying the animal and transporting it from outside the Shabbos limit do not override Shabbos law, although they are prohibited only by rabbinic decree. And using a utensil to remove a moist wart from the animal also does not override Shabbos. The halacha follows the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, and presumably Rabbi Akiva, since he was sticking up for Rabbi Yehoshua in arguing with Rabbi Eliezer. Now we get into the Gemara on this, and here we're going to learn a little bit about when the great sage Hillel first came to Jerusalem. I actually thought about doing a Meet the Mensch class, really focusing on Hillel, but Hillel's story is so big that even though we're going to do a very colorful chapter of it and do a little bit more about Hillel today, this is not a Meet the Mensch class because there's actually this other teaching about how when anger comes in, wisdom goes out. That doesn't relate exactly to Hillel. It goes beyond that, but it's from this page. And so, that's why we're not doing a Meet the Mensch section on Hillel today. Plus, we didn't read that whole Mishna. All right, so let's get into the Gemara. The sages taught a baraisa. The sages taught a baraisa with regard to the basic halacha, the basic law, governing the eve of Passover that occurs on Shabbos. This law was forgotten by the sons of Betera. Now, the sons of Betera, this family of Betera, was a family, esteemed, renowned for their Torah learning. In the late Second Temple period, and even after the destruction of the temple, it was known that the family of Betera, they were all Torah scholars, and they, and at such a high level that they weren't really appointed. They were never appointed the Nasi, the sort of chief rabbi of the Jews, but they could have been. They were at that level, all right. And nevertheless, when this question of what happens when Erev Passover falls on Shabbos itself, and what do we do about slaughtering the Paschal lamb? Somehow they forgot it. I mean, at this point we're 1,300 years away from the Torah being given at Mount Sinai. How is it possible that they could have forgotten such a law? I mean, it has to come up at least once or twice in 20 years that Passover falls out on Saturday night and the slaughtering should be done Saturday afternoon. And somehow, the most knowledgeable people in the land forgot the law, right? And so that's the incident that's being recounted here. So the law was forgotten by the sons of Betera, who were the leaders of their generation. The 14th of Nisan once occurred on Shabbos, and they forgot and did not know whether the Paschal lamb overrides Shabbos or not. They said, "Is there any person who knows whether the Paschal lamb overrides Shabbos or not?" They said to them, "There's a certain man in Jerusalem who came up from Bavel, from Babylonia, and Hillel the Babylonian is his name." Right, so this is going to be late Second Temple period, but about 100 years earlier than the destruction of the Second Temple. At one point, he served the two most eminent scholars of the generation, Shemaiah and Avtalion. And he certainly knows whether the Paschal lamb overrides Shabbos or not. The sons of Betera sent messengers and called for Hillel. They said to him, "Do you know whether the Paschal lamb overrides Shabbos or not?" He said to them, now he must have sort of like drawn back a little bit, like, "I can't believe, are you testing me? How is it possible that you're the leaders of the generation and you don't know this law?" That's not written in here. We don't have the stage notes, as it were. He simply answers, right? And he says, he said to them, "Have we but one Paschal lamb during the year that overrides Shabbos? Do we not have more than 200 Paschal lambs?" In other words, sacrifices during the year that override Shabbos. Now, what he's saying to them is, we don't slaughter animals for our personal consumption on Shabbos. The Paschal lamb is eaten by everybody. But nevertheless, every Saturday, there are offerings being brought in the temple. There's two lambs are offered in the morning, and two are offered in the afternoon. And in fact, additional on Saturday, there's an extra offering that is brought. Or I'm saying there's a morning one and an afternoon, and maybe two of we'll get to that in a moment, more than 200 lambs. And so three versions of this statement are cited in the Jerusalem Talmud. The first reading is more than 100 sacrifices, which only includes the daily sacrifices offered on Shabbos. The second text is more than 200, indicating the daily offerings as well as the additional offerings of Shabbos. In other words, the Musaf. Right now we have a Musaf Amida, a Musaf prayer. It's the additional prayer that we say on Saturday that gets added to the daily prayers. And that corresponds to the additional offerings. So there was a morning offering, there was an afternoon offering, and there's two additional offerings. And all those offerings, those are animals that are slaughtered on Shabbos, every single Shabbos of the year. So we know that there are obligatory offerings whose slaughter overrides Shabbos. That's what Hillel is reminding them. That's how he opens his discourse. Well, they said to him, "From where do you know this?" He said to them, in other words, how are you deriving that law? Even if it's done, how do you derive it? He says, its appointed time is stated with regard to the Paschal lamb, and its appointed time is also stated with regard to the daily offering. For the verse says, Numbers 28:2, "Command the children of Israel and say to them, my offering, the provision of my sacrifice made with fire for a sweet savor to me, a sweet aroma, shall you observe to offer to me, to God, at its appointed time." That's Numbers 28:2. From there we learn that the daily offering is brought even on Shabbos. Thus, the daily morning and afternoon offerings are brought on more than 50 Shabboses over the course of the year. And 2 sheep are offered every Shabbos as additional offerings, right? So there's a morning sheep or goat, I think. There's an afternoon animal that's slaughtered in the afternoon, and on Shabbos there's 2 extras. So there's 4 animals that are slaughtered for the communal offering, the offerings on behalf of the whole Jewish people. This is only when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. But there's 4 animals slaughtered every Shabbos. And obviously their law, because they're obligated, slaughtering them overrides the normal Torah law, Torah level prohibition on slaughtering of Shabbos. And just as the expression "at its appointed time," which is stated with regard to the daily offering, indicates that it overrides Shabbos, so too its appointed time, which is stated with regard to the Paschal lamb, indicates that it overrides Shabbos. And furthermore, we can make a kal v'chomer inference, and a fortiori inference, if the daily offering, the neglect of which is not punishable by kares, right, excision, death at the hands of the heavenly court, and nevertheless it overrides Shabbos, is it not right that the Paschal lamb, that the Passover offering, the neglect of which is punishable by kares, death at the hands of the heavenly court, that it must definitely override Shabbos? After Hillel brought these proofs, they immediately seated him at the head and appointed him Nasi, right, the chief, the head of the Sanhedrin, over them, and he expounded the laws of Passover that entire day. In the course of his teaching, he began rebuking them with words. He said to them, "What caused this to happen to you, that I should come up from Babylonia and become Nasi over you? It was the laziness in you that you did not serve the two most eminent scholars of the generation living in Eretz Yisrael, Shemaiah and Avtalion." In other words, the two most prominent Torah teachers living in Israel were these men, Shemaiah and Avtalion, and they're mentioned in the chain of transmission of the oral law from Moses, which began at Sinai, all the way through the judges and the prophets, and then it goes to the pairs, right? The pairs of scholars. And they include Shemaiah and Avtalion, and then Hillel and Shammai. This is Hillel, and then Shemaiah would be his sort of disputation partner. We'll mention that in a minute. But it seems that Hillel knew enough to go to Shemaiah and Avtalion and learn Torah from them, but that the other people who were considered prominent Torah scholars in Israel at the time didn't bother to go to learn from the greatest Torah scholars in their generation. They were complacent and satisfied with their own Torah learning, and that's what Hillel is rebuking them for. They said to Hillel, our teacher, if one forgot and did not bring a knife on the eve of Shabbos and cannot slaughter his Paschal lamb, what is the law? Right, now, we've seen this discussion before when we were in Tractate Shabbos, right? And we saw that if there was a circumcision, and a circumcision does override Shabbos, right? If it happens on the 8th day, if a baby Jewish boy is fit to be circumcised, which has to happen on the 8th day of his life, then even if it's on Shabbos, we override Shabbos and perform the circumcision. If he's not ready, let's say that on the 8th day falls on Friday, but he can't be circumcised that day because he's a little bit when his skin is a little bit yellow, and so they have to postpone the circumcision. Let's say then he's fully healthy enough to be circumcised the next day, which is Saturday, but now it's a 9th day circumcision, so then you wouldn't override Shabbos. You'd wait until Sunday and perform the circumcision then. When we had that discussion, there was also a dispute between the other rabbis and Rabbi Eliezer about bringing the knife for the circumcision, right? Carrying the knife. You need a knife to do the circumcision, but you could have brought the knife to the home where the circumcision would be performed. You could have done that before Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer says you can carry the knife through the public domain. The other rabbis said no, and I believe the law, it was with them. But that was the dispute. So it's very similar to this dispute here. Okay, so now they're sort of extending that same idea to where Erev Pesach, Erev Passover, falls on Shabbos. So they said to Hillel, our teacher, if one forgot and did not bring a knife on the eve of Shabbos, right, on Friday afternoon, and he cannot slaughter the Paschal lamb because he lacks the knife, what is the law? Since he could have brought the knife before Shabbos, he cannot bring it on Shabbos. But what should he do in this situation? What should he do? Hillel said to them, I once heard this halacha from my teachers. I heard this law from my teachers, but I have forgotten it. Right. So he was very, high and mighty, somewhat arrogant, rebuking his elders who just honored him and said, okay, you be the chief over us. You know more than we do. But it wasn't enough for him to be appointed the head over them. He rebuked them for not learning these laws. And why did they not learn them? Because they didn't study with the greatest sages of their generation. But now they come right back to him with a question for him, and he can't remember the answer. He knows he heard it, but he can't remember it. So he says to them, I once heard this law from my teachers, but I have forgotten it. However, leave it to the Jewish people. If they are not prophets to whom God has revealed his secrets, they are the sons of prophets, and they will certainly do the right thing on their own. Another way that you often hear this put, at least if you like to read Patrick O'Brian and the novels of Captain Jack Aubrey and his good friend, the ship's doctor, Stephen Maturin, is Dr. Maturin, who's a great natural philosopher and a naturalist, and as well as a medical doctor and an intelligence agent. But he often says in those books, the wisdom of the population is rarely off, right? Like you will rarely find that an opinion universally held in a company, in a small town or in the crew of a ship, that it is wrong. If they all believe it, there's going to be something to it. They're probably right. And Hillel here is saying a similar thing. He says, well, you and I, we're the Torah scholars, and we can't remember, but I bet somebody among the common people will know what to do. The next day, on Shabbos, that was the eve of Passover, one whose Paschal offering was a lamb took the knife and stuck it in its wool. And one whose Paschal offering was a goat, which does not have wool, stuck the knife between its horns. Hillel saw the incident, and he remembered the law that he had once learned from his teachers, and he said, yes, this is the tradition I received from the mouths of Shemaiah and of Talion, meaning that this is in fact the proper course of action. So they can't carry the knife in order to slaughter the animal, but they can sort of nestle the knife in the wool of the lamb or between the horns of the goat, and then the animal can carry it itself. Now you might say, well, wait a minute. Aren't you therefore asking an animal to do work for you on Shabbos, which is definitely prohibited by Torah law? And the answer is yes, but if you're just putting the knife in the wool, that's not the normal manner of animals doing work for you. And as we've seen, for the purposes of Shabbos, in particular here to fulfill a mitzvah, if you're going to violate what would otherwise be a Torah prohibition, but you're doing it in a very unusual manner that shows that you're aware of the law and you're not, asking the beast to be a beast of burden for you, but rather to carry the knife in an unusual way so that you don't violate the rabbinic decree on carrying on Shabbos, then this is going to be permitted. And that is, in fact, the halacha. That is the way to do it if you have to bring the knife for this animal to slaughter it on Erev Pesach, which coincides with Shabbos. Now, in a moment, I'm going to share this teaching about haughtiness and anger and how they drive away wisdom and even prophecy. But before I do that, let me just share a little bit of the background here. There's the Koran Talmud includes these nice notes about personalities. And so, like I said, we're not doing a whole Meet the Mensch session on Hillel, but having mentioned Hillel, let's learn a few poignant details about Hillel's life. So Hillel, referred to as the elder, Hillel the elder, not because he was the older Hillel, but because of his position as the chief of the Sanhedrin, the Nasi, the prince of the Sanhedrin. He was born in Babylonia, and he lived in Jerusalem during the time of King Herod and the Roman Emperor Augustus. About 100 years before the destruction of the Second Temple. He and his colleague Shammai were the last of the Zugot, the pairs of Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnaic period, and they were the last of the pairs, right? So if you have that transmission of Torah that begins, like I mentioned before, with Moses at Sinai, and then goes to Joshua, and from Joshua to the elders, and then to the judges, and then to the prophets, and then to the men of the great assembly, and then eventually gets passed down through these pairs, Shemaiah and Avtalion, and then Hillel and Shammai. There's a few other pairs as well. Although Hillel and Shammai established two distinct schools, right? And we call those Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, the house of Hillel, the house of Shammai, or the followers of Hillel and the followers of Shammai. And their disciples were involved in many controversies. Hillel and Shammai themselves disagreed only with regard to 3 or 4 cases. The real difference between them was one of character. The way that they taught was a function of their personality, and they were very different personalities. The real difference was their character. Hillel was a calm and gentle individual who avoided conflict whenever possible, whereas Shammai was stern and uncompromising. When approached by a potential convert whom Shammai had rejected because he wished to learn the entire Torah while standing on one foot, Hillel offered him the maxim, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. That is the whole Torah, and the rest is interpretation. Go and learn." It's a very famous story. So this fellow who was not a Jew, was thinking about converting to Judaism, wanted to know what he was signing up for. He went to the most famous teacher at that time, Shammai, and he said, I'm thinking about converting to Judaism. Can you just teach me the whole Torah while I'm standing on one foot? In other words, teach me the whole Torah. About how much time can I stand on one foot? Maybe half an hour at the most. Can you teach me the whole Torah in about 30 minutes? And Shammai's like, we spend lifetimes. As we've seen, the oral tradition goes back 3,000 years, and we haven't begun to complete our study of the Torah in 3,000 years, and you want to learn the whole thing in 30 minutes? Get out of here. And so he never would have converted to Judaism if he had only met Shammai. But then he went and asked Hillel, can you teach me the whole Torah while standing on one foot? And Hillel said, basically, that which is hateful to you, don't do it to other people. The rest is commentary. Now go and learn. So he was able to give him a teaching that perhaps would have worked for anybody, or more likely, Hillel could read this person very well. He was that great and gifted of a teacher. And he saw that this would be, obviously it's just a very short piece of wisdom. It's been quoted so many times over the centuries since as it's the ultimate, right? That which is hateful to you, don't do it to other people. Treat people the way you want to be treated, right? But the rest is commentary. Now go and learn. And then that man did go and start learning. And later he realized how arrogant he'd been in the way that he approached both Hillel and Shammai, and he was humbled by it. But he always felt very grateful that even though he had been arrogant and sort of rude to these great teachers, that Hillel didn't get upset or flustered, just gave him a little piece of wisdom and then encouraged him to start learning, which he did. According to tradition, Hillel arrived in the land of Israel to study at age 40 and in a state of poverty, right? So he didn't even start studying till he was 40. But his perseverance brought him to the attention of Shemaiah and Avtalion, the heads of the academy, who welcomed him into the study hall. Ultimately, serving those scholars allowed him to settle questions whose solutions were unknown to others, and he was appointed the head of the Sanhedrin. The Gemara compares Hillel to Ezra the scribe, Ezra who reestablished Torah learning in Israel after the Babylonian exile. So after the first temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, then there was 70 years where there was no temple, and most of the Jews were exiled away from the land of Israel into Babylonia. Then it was, I think it was Darius and Cyrus who allowed the temple to be rebuilt and for Jews to come back to the land of Israel. But over those 70 years, so much learning had been forgotten that really the Jewish project could have died, and the second temple didn't get rebuilt. But Ezra the scribe is credited with teaching and motivating the people to come back under the wings of the Shekhinah, under the wings of the divine presence, and to learn and to conduct themselves as observant Jews and reestablish Torah in Israel. Ezra the scribe, Ezra from the book of Ezra, is credited with that kind of saving the Jewish people, and Hillel is also. So the Gemara compares Hillel to Ezra the scribe, crediting him with reestablishing Torah at a period in history when it was being forgotten. Right, this is when King Herod was in charge. He was a great builder. He built a lot of buildings that are still around even, but he was not great for encouraging the people to learn Torah. His disciples, Hillel's disciples, were praised as well. According to the Gemara, Hillel the elder had 80 students personally. 30 of them were worthy that the divine presence rest upon them like Moses. 30 that the sun should stand still for them as it did for Joshua, Joshua who became the leader of the Jewish people after Moses. And then there were 20 who were average, with the greatest of the average students being Yonasan ben Uziel, and the least among them being Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. So what they're saying is that if you learn personally from Hillel, that made you a Torah scholar at such a high level that he had 80 students, and the lowest achiever among the 80 is named as Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is another one who is credited with saving Judaism when it might otherwise have faded into non-existence. Why? Because when the second temple was destroyed, it was Yochanan ben Zakkai who negotiated with the Roman general that destroyed the temple and destroyed Rome that he should give him Yavne and its sages, meaning that Torah learning would be permitted to continue by the Roman authority, just not in Jerusalem, but in the small town of Yavne. And it was because of that and the sages working in Yavne that modern Judaism, absent sacrifices, absent the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, but based on prayer and charity and atonement, modern Judaism as we know it now was really, you can credit Yochanan ben Zakkai with creating the project that led to modern temple, a Judaism without a holy temple. So Yochanan ben Zakkai is really one of the greatest scholars in history and one of the great heroes of the Jewish people. And he was, out of 80 students of Hillel, the lowest achieving one. So you can imagine what a great teacher Hillel was. Okay. So, all right. And then I don't think we need that. And so we already explained how that law works. That he couldn't remember how to bring a knife when you had to bring the knife in order to be able to slaughter the Paschal offering on Shabbos, but the people themselves, just the common people, knew how to do it. And then Hillel remembered that he had already learned that teaching from Shemaiah and Avtalion, from his teachers. I'm almost done, so if you have questions or comments, please put them in the comments now, and Nina will pass them to me. So we saw that Hillel, he was such a brilliant student of Shemaiah and Avtalion that, it was like he was amazed that who were supposed to be the Torah authorities in Israel at that time, they couldn't remember what to do when Erev Pesach fell on Shabbos afternoon, and he rebuked them for it. But then when they asked him, okay, well, what about if you forgot the knife when you need to slaughter it on Shabbos afternoon? What do you do about that? And he couldn't remember what he had learned from his own. He did study with those teachers, and yet he forgot what the law was with respect to that situation. With regard to the incident with Hillel, Rav Yehuda said, anyone who acts haughtily, right? Haughtily, like holding yourself up over others. Arrogance, right? Anyone who acts with arrogance. If he is a Torah scholar, his wisdom departs from him. And if he is a prophet, his prophecy departs from him. I mean, imagine that. You could be the most learned person in the world. if you expect to be honored because you're so learned, and you rebuke people for not being as learned as you're going to lose your own wisdom. And if you're a prophet, you're going to lose your ability to prophesy. That's according to Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav. The Gemara explains, if he is a Torah scholar, his wisdom departs from him, as is learned from Hillel in this incident. For the master said in his Baraisa, Hillel began to rebuke them with words because he acted haughtily. He ended up saying to them, I once heard this halakha, but I have forgotten it, as he was punished for his haughtiness by forgetting the law in a very public way. That if one is a prophet, his prophecy departs from him. This is learned from Devorah, right? So from the great prophetess Devorah in the Bible. As it is written, the villagers ceased. They ceased in Israel until I, Devorah, or in English, Deborah, arose, and I arose a mother in Israel. That's from the book of Judges 5:7. For these words of self-glorification, Devorah was punished with a loss of her prophetic spirit, as it is written later that it was necessary to say to her, awake, awake, Devorah, awake, awake, utter a song, in Judges 5:12, because her prophecy had left her. Similarly, Resh Lakish said, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, any person who becomes angry, if he is a scholar, his wisdom departs from him. And if he is a prophet, his prophecy departs from him. And the Gemara explains that if he is a scholar, his wisdom departs from him. We learn this from Moses himself. As it is written, this is from Numbers 31:14, and Moses became angry with the officers of the host, the captains over thousands and the captains over hundreds who came from the battle. Right? He became angry at them. He lost his temper. And what was his punishment? As it is written afterward, 7 verses later at Numbers 31:21, as it is written afterward, and Elazar the priest said to the men of war who went to the battle, this is the statute of the law which the Lord commanded Moses, which proves by inference that this law had become hidden from Moses due to his anger, right? The law should have been spoken to these people by Moses, but instead, his nephew, Elazar, the high priest, it was given to him to transmit the law, not Moses himself. Why? Because he became angry. And that if he is a prophet, now it's interesting, Moses was obviously a prophet, but there it was using him as an example of a scholar who knows the law and forgets the law. Here, and if he is a prophet, his prophecy departs from him if he becomes angry. We learn this from the prophet Elisha, as it is written that he became angry when the king of Israel, he became angry with the king of Israel and said to him, were it not that I have regard for the presence of Jehoshaphat, the king of Judea, I would not look toward you nor see you. That's 2nd book of Kings 3:14. And it is afterwards written, but now bring me a minstrel. And it came to pass when the minstrel played that the hand of the Lord came upon him. So this is actually something that we've learned before, that sometimes the prophets, they needed to enter a state of prophecy. It eluded them. They couldn't they couldn't get into that prophetic trance so that they could hear the word of God and transmit it to the people who were waiting for an answer. And so to help them enter the prophetic state, they would bring a musician. And sometimes the musician playing music could help the prophet fall into a state of prophecy. Because Elisha became angry with the king of Israel, his prophetic spirit departed from him, and a musician was needed to rouse it anew. This is the last paragraph I'll be doing. Rabbi Mani Bar Patish said, whoever becomes angry, even if greatness has been apportioned to him from heaven, he is lowered from his greatness. From where do we derive this? From Eliab, David's older brother, King David's older brother. As it is stated, and Eliab's anger burned against David, And he said, "Why did you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your insolence and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle," right? This is when young David came to the battle, where eventually he would say, "Let me fight this giant Goliath." Nobody else wanted to do it. David was willing, and that's really when David becomes, his first heroic episode that eventually leads to him becoming king of Israel. And so when he gets there, his older brother, Eliab, says, "What the hell are you doing here? You're supposed to be home minding the sheep of the family business while we're here soldiering." And when Samuel went to anoint him, after God had told him that one of the sons of Yishai was going to be a king, concerning all of the other brothers, it is written, "No, the Lord has not chosen this one." Because there were 7 brothers, right? David was the youngest of 7 brothers. "The Lord has not chosen this one," at 1 Samuel 16:8. Whereas with regard to Eliab, it is written, "And the Lord said to Samuel, look not at his appearance, nor at the height of his stature, for I have rejected him." Right? It seems like perhaps Eliab would have been the one, but he was passed over for David. And perhaps because Eliab was found to be by God unworthy to become king because of his anger and the way he treated his younger brother when he came down, when he should have been minding the sheep. And this proves by inference that until now, God had loved him. And it was only at this point that Eliab was rejected. Had it not been for his anger, Eliab would have been fit for greatness. But owing to this shortcoming, God rejected him. So that is a pretty powerful lesson of how dangerous it is to give in to anger. It is something to be avoided. And so today, when I was installing and trying to get this new electronic doorbell, working and sunk up with the house, why would I bother getting angry about that? It's just a silly thing to get angry about. I had a very limited amount of time to try to get that done. I had other work to do. I thought I could get that job done in 5 or 10 minutes. Not surprisingly, it turned into a 1 hour, 1.5 hour chore. And I was just losing my patience. And no, that's exactly the kind of thing that we want to train ourselves to overcome as we refine our character and we become more of a mensch, right? More of a dignified human being. We try to train ourselves to be more unflappable, and we're not going to lose our cool just because of the little challenges that come up in any day. So I regret becoming angry about that silliness, and I'm glad that I read this teaching about how anger and haughtiness can cause a person to lose their wisdom, to lose even their sense of the divine, and even whatever greatness might have been planned for them, they might even lose that owing to anger. We should always be working on managing our anger. Okay. All right, let me get to questions and comments. First, let me mention that this Thursday is Tu B'Shvat, the 15th of the Hebrew month of Shvat. It's often known as the birthday of the trees, but it's much more interesting and deeper than that. And we're going to be doing a Kabbalistic, Talmudic Tu B'Shvat Seder. That's going to be at 2 p.m. Pacific. And it's sort of like a Passover Seder. There's a script for it and a bunch of blessings that we say. And basically the idea is that we're enjoying fruit for the first time in this calendar year. There's going to be a lot of different dried fruits that we're going to access. It's going to be really beautiful. We haven't done this before, so watch for that on Thursday, AT Live at 2 p.m. Pacific. Bill Eldridge, not for the first time and probably not for the last. I'm much more sympathetic to Eliezer's position than Akiva's. Yehudit Sobo, interesting observation, Bill. It may be time to reevaluate. It may be time to reevaluate my thought process as well. Bill answered, I guess Yehudit, so far as I can tell from our journey to date and encounters with Eliezer, his theological method is very close to mine, a very stringent reading of the tradition most of the time, but make it as easy as possible for people to do the works of righteousness and mercy. Or as my personal heroes, Dorothy Day and Peter Morin put it, we should strive to make a world where it's easier to do good. On the other hand, says Bill, I reflect on what happens to Eliezer with some trepidation because of that, right? Eliezer, very strict for the tradition, but always trying to find that opening on behalf of people. Unfortunately, as when we'll come to that story, I think in Bava Metzia, halfway through our 7.5-year journey through the Talmud, when he really stuck to his guns in the face of opposition from all the other sages, that's when he should have been a little bit more easygoing, not just on behalf of the people, but also on behalf of his colleagues and his teachers. And, the story did not end up well. It's a very colorful story, but it didn't end up so well for Eliezer. With regard to avoiding anger, Pam Simmons says it is like saying blinded by anger. When anger is present, it blinds, and nothing else can be seen or revealed. Very good, Pam. You got it exactly right. And finally, Renee, gifts of wisdom and prophecy depart as a result of haughtiness. Tzimtzum, as a pulling away and a coming toward throughout a relationship with Hashem, musing whether greater humility leads to less experience of separation. Right? So Renee is saying, that this idea that, okay, prophets lose their prophecy when they engage in haughtiness or anger. Okay, so we're not prophets. But if you're the type of person that's a little bit mystically oriented, right, and you're looking not just to learn God's teachings, but to really feel, to experience the presence of God, if we act in an angry or arrogant manner, that's going to become just about impossible. Just about impossible. And this idea of tzimtzum, that's a very Kabbalistic concept. This is the idea that the way that the universe was created, it's that within God created a space where God's presence is not revealed, it's hidden, and that is the space within God where the universe could come into being. This physical universe is a place where God's presence is hidden. So God withdraws, right? And so this idea, I think that Renee is suggesting, is that when we're acting in this self-serving, haughty, angry manner, God doesn't really want any part of that. God enjoys seeing us be kind and be humble. So God removes a little bit of God's revealed presence from the haughty, from the angry, when we, deal with those emotions and access, treat the world, treat every day in this world as a cause for joy and gratitude, then God allows God's presence to sort of come back into the space around us and to be more revealed. That's what I've got for us today. Thank you for your comments and questions. This was a great lesson on the early days of Hillel and the dangers of haughtiness and anger. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. That's when Tu B'Shvat will be beginning. And then we'll do that Tu B'Shvat Seder at 2 p.m. Pacific on Thursday, when we'll say a bunch of blessings and Kabbalistic teachings with respect to